Hi, Dermot Power here with another amazing story from Irish history. And today's story centres in this beautiful village here of Killinick, County Wexford. The episode resulted in the serious injury to two adults and to the death of a 3-year-old girl at the hands of a deranged Catholic priest whose name was Father John Carroll. He thought he was doing God's work by performing an exorcism, as he believed, on a young 3-year-old girl. Her name was Catherine Sinnott. It resulted in her death. Join me while I tell you the full story of Father John Carroll and the exorcism of Catherine Sinnott. First of all, we must put context on the story, and we must go back to 19th century Ireland. Now, Ireland in the 19th century, and indeed well into the 20th century, two things dominated the lives of the Irish people. One was an unquestioning faith they had in the Roman Catholic religion. The words of the priests were the same as if it came from God. People's lives revolved around folk cures, spirits, particularly fairies, and all things spiritual. Not necessarily spiritual in the spiritual meaning of the word, but rather superstition. An example would be that during the cholera outbreak of 1832 and 1849, the main cure and talisman, should I say, for cholera was that people would get a stick. They would partially burn it, dip it in holy water, and then pass it around from house to house as a talisman against the cholera. The same as in the Bible, where the Israelites put the blood on their doors and the angel of death passed around when they were in Egypt. Exactly the same. On August the 7th, 1824, the Waterford newspaper reported that 6 people, one of whom was a Roman Catholic priest, was to appear before the assizes in Wexford. The assizes were the courts. And the priest was accused of murder, and the others were accused of being accessories. The priest was Father John Carroll. He was a Roman Catholic curate in, people call it now, Killinick, but the old people would have called it Clinic in County Wexford. He had studied for the priesthood in Carlow and was ordained in 1814. After he had been charged with murder, the Carlow's newspapers reported that the Carlow Seminary had refused to ordain Father Carroll, so he went to another diocese and he was ordained there. After the incident which brought him before the courts, the Wexford newspapers claimed that insanity was hereditary in his family, as his uncle had committed suicide some months before. Father John Carroll was appointed curate of Kilrush, County Wexford in 1814, and was appointed curate to the parish of Ballymore in 1819. Clinic, where the incident took place, is in that parish. 5 years later, around 7 p.m. on a Friday on July the 9th, 1824, Father Carroll visited a man by the name of Neil. It had been reported that he was seriously ill, so Father Carroll decided to go and visit him. On entering Neil's house, he decided that Neil was suffering from devil possession. He jumped on the bed and on top of Mr. Neil in the bed, jumping up and down on Neil in the bed. While this was going on, one of the onlookers, Peggy Danby was her name, went into hysterics, screaming and collapsed on the floor. Father Carroll jumped from Neil's bed onto the floor where Peggy Danby was and began to jump up and down on her, breaking several of her ribs and crushing her breastbone. Father Carroll then left that scene and left Peggy Danby on the ground, as he said, blood gurgling in her throat. Some of the women onlookers said and swore that they saw demons coming out of Peggy Danby's mouth. Carroll then left the scene, leaving poor Peggy Danby almost dead. And he said he was going down to the Assally Bridge, about 400 yards from Clinic, and said he was going to dump the reptiles and the demons into hell. Witnesses said that there were over 300 people at the scene at the time, a large amount of people. Father Carroll then went to the house of a man called Robert Morden. He attacked his wife in the house and beat her so severely that her head was swollen to a shocking degree, as was described in the newspapers. Around 9 p.m, Carroll visited the house of Thomas Sinnott of Clinic. He was accompanied by a large crowd at this time. Father Carroll went into the house and asked for some refreshments, which he got, when suddenly Sinnott's young child, a little girl 3.5 years old, began to cry. Immediately, Carroll consulted his breviary and said she's possessed by the devil. He went into the room, did exactly the same as he did in Neil's house. He jumped up on the bed and began jumping up and down on the little girl, seriously injuring her. He then asked for a tub of water, a large wooden tub. He blessed it, and then he poured the water on the little girl in the bed. And at this time, she was bleeding profusely. When all of a sudden Carroll shouted, "I have performed a miracle. Behold, I have turned the water into blood." He then alternatively sat on the tub, and then he got up and danced on the tub, whistling an Irish jig all the time. This macabre scene went on for hours. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Carroll decided to leave the house. I should have mentioned that during this period, at the very beginning, when the little girl was screaming out, "Daddy, Daddy, save me, save me," Thomas Sinnott, the father of the little girl, attempted to rescue her, but was held back by the crowd. An unbelievable scene. And what about the mother? What was she doing? Well, she was doing the same as the other 100 or so people gathered in the house, and that was kneeling down, saying their prayers, and encouraging the priest to cast out the demon. A local doctor was sent for, and he came, and he more or less apprehended Carroll and sent for the police. The police came along, and Carroll was lodged in jail. It had appeared that Carroll, for many years, was suffering and being treated by a doctor for insanity, bouts of insanity. The doctor said at the trial that Carroll had stopped taking the medicine 2 months before this particular incident, and that he was in an insane order when he saw him that night. Carroll was eventually brought before the courts in Wexford along with his 5 co-accused. The newspaper reported that Carroll was almost like a marble statue. He was white in the face, pale in the face. No emotion, he displayed no emotion whatsoever. All the time he just looked straight ahead, as I said, like a marble statue. It was quite obvious to all and sundry that the man was mad. The jury only took a couple of minutes to decide that Carroll was indeed mad and found him not guilty. The 5 co-accused who had helped Carroll through the whole episode, and actually these are the 5 that held back Thomas Sinnott from rescuing the little girl, little Catherine. They were also found not guilty because it was deemed that they were under the influence, the hypnotic influence, so to speak, of the priest. Carroll was confined almost immediately in Richmond Lunatic Asylum in Dublin. In October 1832, Carroll wrote to the Lord Lieutenant asking that he be transferred into the care of his father and his sisters. However, the Undersecretary wrote back saying that it had been decided that any person who took the life of another never would be set at liberty. In 1832, very interestingly, he was declared free of lunacy by the governor of Richmond Lunatic Asylum. He was then transferred down to Carlow Asylum, and he seemed to have remained there. And there is a book in the Diocese of Ferden, where he would have been, and that had a list in it called the Sick Priests List. And this list listed priests who were no longer in ministry and deemed to be sick. And Carroll was one of those. His name is in that book from 1826 up to 1849. After 1849, there's no longer a mention of Father John Carroll. So it may be adduced that he died on that year. John Carroll should never have been ordained a priest. And his recent history shows, not only in the Catholic Church, but in many organisations, those of questionable character often slip through the vetting net, destroying organisation and undermining the reputation of many good clergymen who do good. However, Father Carroll was not the only clergyman to bring notoriety to Clinic. In 1825, 1 year after the trial of Father John Carroll, another clergyman of the Church of Ireland in Clinic was brought before the courts charged with blasphemy, profane swearing, lechery, drunkenness, lewd and immoral practices. His name was Reverend Hughes. He was 60 years old at the time. If the devil was in Clinic in the 1820s, it wasn't in sick old men and innocent young children. It seemed to have been taken possession of the clergymen in Clinic at that particular period. And there we must leave Father John Carroll and poor Catherine Sinnott. So for me, Dermot Power, until we meet again with another good story from Irish history.